Okay, I think we're now live. I think we may have been live for a couple of minutes and we just left people waiting in embarrassed silence. I'm not very good at the start or indeed the middle and the end. But anyway, welcome everyone to this latest UK in a Changing Europe lunch hour. Today, we're going to dedicate our session to essentially the state of the European Union. And we've got two brilliant panelists who know more about this subject than anyone I can think of. The one and only Fabian Zuleeg, who is Chief Exec and Chief Economist at the European Policy Centre. Welcome, Fabian. And Christine Ray, who's Professor of European Politics at the Hertie School in Berlin. Welcome to both of you. Essentially, as I said to you before, Christine, I'm going to treat this as a sort of tutorial where you teach us what's going on in the European Union. So just to kick us off, and remember, as always, those watching, stick your questions in the chat. I'm going to make this quite question-led this session, so you might actually get a chance for me to pose your question this week. Put your questions in the chat, vote for the question you want me to pose to the panelists. But just to kick us off, if you can each sort of reflect for a couple of minutes on where you think the EU is at, what the big challenges it's facing are, and then we can go from there. And on the basis of ladies first, let's start with you, Christine.
Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to our lunch discussion. Thank you very much for inviting me, Anand, and I look forward to engaging with Fabian and you all. So maybe just a few words about the outside challenges and the inside challenges. So the outside challenges, I understand Fabian will be talking quite a bit about security, the defense, obviously the Russian aggression in Ukraine, but also trade tariffs, etc. So let me basically come in with three internal challenges. So I would argue the first is France and let's say not the most stable political situation in France at the moment. There is a prime minister who has just survived two confidence votes, third prime minister since the elections last June. And it's very unlikely that the prime minister, Le Cornu, will get a budget through the National Assembly. Now, of course, foreign policy, defense policy is done by the president, Emmanuel Macron. But what's happening inside France, I think, is currently not ideal for the French, but also by extension for the European Union. And we can talk more about France if anyone wishes. The second, and I think that's a challenge which really connects the outside and the inside, is Hungary. No one will be surprised to hear that. I would like to focus on one particular aspect of Hungarian policy, which is the vetoes, repeated vetoes on sanctions against Russia and also on enlargements. And what the European Commission has tried unsuccessfully and is currently being sued for it by the European Parliament is freeze funds and unfreeze funds. Now, this is all related to values in Article 2 and the Article 7 procedure. Now, colleagues of mine have come up with this argument that what you could do with Article 7 also is link it to Hungarian lack of solidarity in common foreign and security policy. Now,
Christine, can you just explain what Article 7 is?
Oh, apologies. So Article 2 holds the values of the European Union, right? Democracy, rule of law. And Article 7 is the article where, should a member state persistently breach those values, all member states, minus the one concerned, can, quote unquote, take away certain privileges from that member state. Now, that's not worked, right? Because there's always one member state that supports Hungary. Now, what currently Slovakia, formerly Poland. So Article 7 hasn't worked, but what my colleagues propose is if you go the lack of solidarity in CFSP, which the European Court of Justice of the European Union has recently established as a concept, as a value, right? linked to all member states, then you could come in, right, with an Article 7 procedure, which would be much easier, they argue, to link to what Hungary is doing. And we can talk more about that in the discussion. The third one, I think, is the so-called simplification agenda. So if you think about the European Union, lots of rules, lots of laws, lots of regulations, lots of directives. And at present, what the European Commission is doing, pushed a lot by the center right in the European Parliament, is to simplify. So what they're doing is taking some of the laws they passed in the past Parliament, for example, in particular on sustainability, and either extend the time by which these should apply or really rule them back a little bit. So I would argue France is an internal problem, but spills over into the EU. Hungary is a persistent problem, but also in particular currently in CFSP and enlargement. And there may be some ways in which Hungary could be reined in. But I also think the simplification agenda is potentially problematic for climate aims in particular. And I'm very happy, Fabian, probably to talk about those issues in the Q&A, which I understand the whole session will be a Q&A.
Thank you, Christine. Fabian.
Yeah, to start off with, I think it's very true that the external and the internal are very much linked. We can't really see them separately, not least because some of the internal issues have a direct impact on the capacity of the union to make decisions, to move forward in particular areas. And that goes way beyond Hungary. We shouldn't forget we also had some other political changes which have resulted in that part of the political spectrum being strengthened again. And of course, we have the chaos in France at the moment. But given all that, we still have a very full agenda. There are many challenges, including external challenges. In that context, it's probably worth noting that von der Leyen had probably the worst summer of her career as a commission president. And that has a lot to do with Washington and what has happened over there. Not least having to negotiate a deal on tariffs, which in many ways is a terrible deal. It breaks many of the principles of the European Union. It's deeply unfavorable to the EU. It makes us look hypocritical in relation to the rest of the world. And yet it is a deal we had to do. So it's not an easy job. And what always happens in those kind of situations is that the Commission then gets blamed for making a terrible deal, even though the member states were very clear that a deal was needed. We have the continuing challenge also of how to deal with Trump when it comes to defense and security in general, but Ukraine in specific, where once again we now have the possibility of a Trump-imposed ceasefire on the agenda, with a meeting upcoming in Budapest between Putin and Trump, maybe involving others as well, but we shall see whether that's the case. Certainly, Putin doesn't want any others there. He wants to deal directly with Trump. And Trump still seems to be maybe blinded by his own brilliance in terms of believing that he can handle Putin and not seeing the true nature of Russia in this context. We have ongoing discussions around frozen assets. We have a summit at the end of this week, which will look into this again. And that's maybe one area where there is a possibility of some form of conclusion coming out of the summit. So the European Union is moving forward. But we also have longer term strands of discussions, defense and security, the capability of European industry, how to deal with that, again, linked also into the competitiveness agenda, linked into the technology agenda. So economic security continues to be on the agenda. And in the background, we have the looming car crash of the multi-annual financial framework, the EU's long-term budget, which is always an unpleasant experience. When it comes to money, the discussions are rather narrow and not very enlightened, but this time round it promises to be even worse than it has been before. And I'm happy to come back to that. The other thing which is increasingly happening, and that I think is a more structural change, which will be interesting for the future, is that we are more and more exploring what can be done outside the treaties, given that there are very strong limitations, what can be done within the treaties, given that also there's a recognition that on some of these issues, you have to involve countries outside the European Union, including the UK, but also, for example, Norway and Canada. On some of these issues, you don't want to involve certain member states within the EU. And you also need some form of coalitions of the willing, given that there isn't a consensus. So that's an ongoing discussion, which is a difficult one, because it does question some of the structures of the European Union. But it's a necessary one, which seems to be the only way we can move forward on some of these issues.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I saw a piece, I think it was Politico yesterday, in which they were suggesting that some people in Brussels are talking about a way of enlarging without giving new member states a veto, which just struck me that, I mean, we should come back onto all this, because sort of constitutional creativity seems very much to be the order of the day in many of these discussions. Just broadly, I mean, just thinking back to my former life as an academic, one of the things that academics used to say is European integration progresses in a crisis. And my word, we have several crises coexisting simultaneously at the moment. I mean, do you see this as an opportunity to sort of build more Europe under the cover of this crisis? I mean, there are people who argue that that's what happened with COVID. In a way, that's what happened through the sovereign debt crisis. Is this an opportunity for Europe to sort of empower itself, do you think, or is it not working like that at the moment?
I think what we have seen also in the more recent crisis is that, yes, Europe moves forward. What has been done, for example, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what was done during COVID was unprecedented. It was, in many ways, the kind of thing people would have said will never happen. And they did happen under that pressure. But there are caveats around that. One is that I think what we are seeing now is what I've called the progress illusion. Because yes, we're moving forward, but the scale and the scope of the challenges which we are facing is actually increasing faster than our responses.
Yeah.
We have exponential challenges, and we're still trying to make linear policy to address them. And what that implies is actually, in reality, the gap is getting bigger rather than smaller. I think the second problem we are facing is that very often when we then move forward, it is done in a way which is at least questioning the legitimacy of that. Many populations are then seeing, and governments are seeing what they see as overreach. They're saying the European Union is doing things which we never intended the Union to do. It's not in the treaties. It's not what we should be doing. And that creates a political headwind. And I think what we are also seeing now is really that structurally the internal politics of the Union are becoming so much of a blockage that it's almost impossible to get anything really ambitious done. When you hear these discussions with pro-European politicians, you very often hear, yes, we agree with all of that, but it's politically impossible to do.
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting also about what Fabian said. So the challenges essentially are moving with us and overtaking the EU. It's a little bit what you just said. I think COVID-19 was a little different in terms of a crisis with the Next Generation EU Fund, the Recovery and Resilience Fund. So a lot of money was given to the European Union, and for the first time, the European Commission was allowed to borrow internationally. Now, the question is what is happening with the new budget, and whether the huge sum of money that the EU was given and is handing out to countries that were particularly hard hit by COVID. Several heads of state or of government have already said, no way, this is going to be repeated. So the question really is, perhaps the EU responded well to the COVID crisis in terms of responded well by putting resources where resources were needed. But will the EU have those resources in the future? I'm very doubtful, looking, for example, at the first reactions to the budget proposal the Commission tabled in July. So my second point relates a little bit to sort of what Anand said and also what Fabian just said right now, and concerns enlargement. I do think member states realize that moving forward, as we have tried to, is no longer working. I think that gets us into the constitutional creativity moment Anand was alluding to. But I also read about this proposal to not give new members, it's not a proposal, let's say, call it official gossip, that potentially new member states would not have veto powers in their first years of membership until the treaties have been changed. I'm doubtful this will work. European Council President Costa has also argued we need to not have unanimity every single step of the enlargement process. Let's see whether that is a possibility. But I think in principle, the key challenge is that you need unanimity to change treaties. There will not be unanimity at present, I think, in the European Union to give the EU greater powers. And there will also not be unanimity in the European Council to give the EU greater resources. So yes, I think there's crisis, and in crisis, the EU moves forward. I think COVID is a particularly good example of the EU moving forward. But I do not think that the EU will have enough resources to actually move. And
you both mentioned domestic political challenges. So just a quick question. I hope one of you knows the answer to. I mean, much was made post-EU referendum here that support for European integration went up quite significantly across member states. Where is it now? Is there an anti-EU feeling that's taking root in member states, or is our support levels still quite high?
Fabian,
yeah, I mean, support continues to be rather high, but it is also, I think, important to look at that in a more differentiated way. I think when we're talking in rather general terms, yes, people tend to agree that not only support for European integration is high, but they speak specifically about issue areas where they would expect Europe to act together. And defense and security, for example, is one of those areas where there's a very clear support in the population. But does that translate into support for the processes, the institutions, for the kind of compromises governments would have to make? I'm much more skeptical about that. So yes, at a general level, this is true. But when it gets specific, that's where the problem lies. And I think in the end, it is a general problem in democracies at the moment, that the compromises you need to make are politically very costly. And for that reason, politicians are shying away from making these compromises.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the CFSP defense has been one of the most salient and positively salient issues so important issues for the European public. Has it translated into the EU having a proper security and policy, foreign policy competence? No, I always think you need to go into the individual member states. So just because aggregate figures are looking decent, I think you really need to look into individual member states. And again, France, I think, is pretty problematic. So France has really moved down, 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 down in the years that I've looked at Eurobarometer results. And France really, in that respect, also worries me quite a bit. Italy also, but France in particular.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to France because, as you know, nothing cheers a Brit up quite so much as the French having problems. So we will talk about that.
Hey,
later.
what about the Germans?
But just for the moment, I mean, one of the problems that plagues Europe is, same as here, is the problem of economic growth. And what we've had over the last few years is we've had two big reports from two former Italian prime ministers, the Draghi report and the Letta report, each proposing steps that need to be taken. Quite apocalyptic language, actually, in the Draghi report about the costs of inaction. To date, I mean, the Financial Times is trying to track this and is taking this quite seriously. Not much of what Draghi proposed has been implemented. What do you think the prospects are of actually seeing more progress on that front, or is this going to fall into exactly the sort of problems that Fabian outlined, that the domestic compromises and decisions you need to make to do this sort of thing are just too difficult? Do you think there's a prospect for Draghi to be more fully implemented going forward?
So is that Christine or me?
But either of you.
Fabian, why don't you start and then I come in?
I'm happy to start, but I'm not sure happy is the right word. Because I think what is important when we look at Draghi is not only looking at the specific measures, but as you said, when you look at the language of the Draghi report really calls for change in mindset. When we look across the measures, frankly, for those of us who've done European economic reform for a long time, there's not that much new in it. A lot of these things we know, we have known for a very long time. It was important to have this in and have the weighty name attached to it. But in the end, it's really about this, are we committing, are we focusing on making these changes? And on that basis, I think the answer, unfortunately, clearly has to be no. We have not made that switch. I don't see that we have the political consensus to push things forward. And I think this, if I have one criticism of the Draghi report, it's not about what's in the report, but it's in the way it was launched. I think Draghi should have gotten some member states behind him at that stage. That would have given it a lot more weight in the debate. But so far, no, we're not doing it because doing these things are politically painful. Otherwise, we would have done them a long time ago. So you have to confront vested interests, you have to confront national prerogatives, you have to confront the politics in some of the member states. And at the moment, people are not willing to do that. I think we should look at some of the lighthouse projects. And I think there still is a chance to push those forward. But we also need the Commission to be much more forceful in pushing them forward, hopefully working together with the Council President. So for me, issues like Capital Markets Union, no matter what we call it, we have gone through different iterations. In the decades we have been talking about it. And I think this is clearly one of those areas where, from an economic point, it makes absolute sense. There's no reason why we should not be moving forward. So if we can move forward on issues like that, I think that would be a very positive sign, rather than focusing on cutting bureaucracy, omnibuses, etc., which always, in my view, promise more than they can keep.
Yeah, I would really like to come in here because I see two ways in which competitiveness is supposed to be improved. So the omnibuses Fabian is talking about are legislative proposals by the European Commission to simplify slash deregulate and include, I think there are quite a few by now. And I would argue they fall into a way of defining competitiveness as simplification, perhaps deregulation also, and rolling back bureaucracy right now. I think that's the one side of a really non-defined concept. Fabian, I would be curious if you could tell us what competitiveness actually is. But I think that's one side of the debate. The other side of the debate is, of course, invest, right? And I think that was more Draghi's side, the argument that what we need if we want to move the economy forward, right, is again a lot of resources. And I don't currently see either of those working, being put in place. I'm pretty critical of the omnibuses, especially if they deregulate. I'm not sure we are in a moment in time where deregulating on climate, on sustainability, on reporting actually help the world, but also help the business, right? So also small business, if you have reporting standards and you have this one report you need to write, because it's part of a particular directive and you need to very simply do it, you can reuse it for all your investors, for your supply chains, for everything where you need to interact. If you don't have to do it, you have to do this every single time. So does it really save businesses resources if it's not standardized would be my question. And then the Savings and Investments Union or the Capital Markets Union, that's a clear example where you have to harmonize, right? At present, we have 27 markets, 27 capital markets, right? So the same country that calls for simplification, my country, Germany, also calls, right, for capital market union. How is this going together? So I'm a little skeptical that the EU is actually knowing where it wants to go, and B, succeeding in going there, either, again, lack of resources or perhaps not effective, successful simplification.
Of course, at the same time, it was the German government that blocked the takeover of Commerzbank by UniCredit. And it strikes me that if you want to move towards a more sort of integrated banking system in Europe, you need those sorts of... Actually, one of the interests, I was threatening at the start that we do this whole session without talking about the UK, but I'm going to fail.
We've mentioned it at least 5 times already.
Just because, you know, one of the interesting things about Enrico Letta at the moment is that he's arguing quite strongly, not just in favor of greater financial market integration across Europe, but that it's important that the United Kingdom be included in this, not least to provide, you know, the capital markets of the city for the rearmament project that Europe has underway. What do you make of that argument? I'll ask you first, Fabian, because I expect you to be cynical about this.
I'm surprisingly not cynical about it,
It's all going
because
wrong.
I've been arguing for this for quite some time, and it also some of the discussions we had with Enrico Letta, we have actually made the argument that ultimately, if you want a well-functioning capital market in a global environment where we have much more national politics going into economics in all areas, then it makes perfect sense to link the UK capital market to the rest of the EU. But of course, it comes with a sting in the tail, because that would also mean that the UK would have to consider in how far it can harmonize its regulatory system to fit with that. So in a sense, we are then into the dynamic alignment discussion, which is politically not very easy in the UK. So it's not a straightforward proposition from both sides. And I think this is clearly where the political problem comes back into this. For any of these, you have to face certain trade-offs. You cannot get something for nothing. So if you want to have UK capital markets integrated better, these are the trade-offs you are going to face. But in every area, we have to make these decisions.
Yeah.
And this is something where I think we have rather a lack in Europe at the moment of that kind of strategic thinking. What is it we are actually trying to achieve? Strategic thinking about Europe, and I mean Europe here in the broader sense, not just the European Union, doesn't happen in Brussels. It doesn't happen in Berlin. Unfortunately, at this moment in time, it happens in Washington, it happens in Moscow, and it happens in Beijing.
I mean, you don't, can I keep going, Christine? You don't need to come in on this, do you? Okay. I mean, to what extent is the sort of absence of that Franco-German engine that people have counted on for so long damaging the ability of the European Union to react decisively? And insofar as that is an issue, I mean, to what extent is the disappearance of France, because France is now so concerned with domestic politics, going to harm the European Union?
So on the Franco-German engine, I think it's been very stuttering for several years, right? So I think the last time that it worked well, like really well, was the Merkozy duo during the sovereign debt crisis, right? Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy cooperating very closely. I think since then, it's been difficult between Germany and France. And I think this has a number of reasons. At present, of course, Emmanuel Macron is busy with his home front. He's also very much out there. He was, as we all know, right, one of the countries that recognized a Palestinian state at the UN General Assembly recently. France projecting, I think, trying to project into the world. But France is also very busy with domestic politics. I think Friedrich Merz is much more pro-European than Olaf Scholz, although I always think Scholz doesn't get enough credit that as finance minister, he agreed to the Next Gen EU project, right? Which wouldn't have really been possible with previous German finance ministers. I think he's much more pro-European, but he's also quite a conservative politician. So I think he does believe in simplification. He does believe in deregulation. And I don't think the two sides really fit in that respect. And I do think the Franco-German alliance itself can't move Europe forward, but if they have a proposal that they are both completely believing in, I think the EU can move. So a few weeks ago, we had Lars Klingbeil, the German finance minister, here at the Hertie School, and he seems to be in good conversation with France. Let's see about the capital markets union / savings and investment union. So he seems to be much more aware what needs to be done, whether he can find a solution on this particular issue, which I think is pretty crucial, especially for startups, for example. I don't think Europe can afford startups going to the US to get money and then come back if we are lucky. But I do think there may be some movements, but sort of the big ideas, sort of the big move forward by the Franco-German alliance, I think is not there at present. The question is,
for you, Fabian, it's also a far bigger union than it used to be, isn't it? So, I mean, even if the Franco-German alliance were functioning quite well, there are some very recalcitrant member states to persuade, aren't there? I mean, it's very noticeable that we've gone a long, long time since we've had an intergovernmental conference. And and one can guess at what the reason for that is. But is there the prospect at all of significant reform of the European Union now? And if so, actually, going back to something you said earlier, how would working outside the treaties be one way of dealing with this?
Just one sentence on Merz as well. I think one of the issues with Merz is that even when he does the right thing, he doesn't seem to be very good at selling it. What he did right when he came in terms of increasing spending in Germany for defense and security was even recognized by the German public as being the right thing, but he didn't get the credit for it because in the election campaign he argued against it.
Yeah.
So there is something there also about his character and about his ability to lead in a positive way.
I completely agree on that, and it was a little bit the same with our previous government.
Yeah.
So good policies badly sold.
Yes. But yes, we have a very different union, and Christina already said, which I think is absolutely right. It's not automatic that if France and Germany agree on something, then it will happen. Even in the best of circumstances, it's a different dynamic now. You will almost inevitably get individual countries which just say straight away no, who are not going to be part of it. You have the threat of vetoes always hanging in the background. So it has become very difficult to move forward. And that is precisely why I think in a number of areas you are thinking about mechanisms which are outside the union. Now, we've done this before. It's not the first time. And this is also in part the answer to your question about reform. I think it's very unlikely that we will get a big intergovernmental conference with a new treaty, etc. I think it would also be very risky to do that, and it would take an enormous amount of time, which we don't have. But the treaties are quite flexible in some areas. So we have done a number of things, at times by using certain clauses in the treaties, at times by doing it outside the treaties, but aligned with the general purpose. So
Can you give us some examples?
So if we're looking at, for example, what was put into place in response to the economic and financial crisis, we had one article in the treaties doing a lot of heavy lifting, which was basically just putting everything through as emergency measures, which in the end the court signed off, but still it stretched, I would say, the limits of the treaty. Or when we look at the fiscal compact, where we had the threat from the UK that they would veto the move forward, and the agreement was simply we do it without the UK. So the other member states just move ahead, and the UK was left outside. This is not easy because when it touches then competences of the union, how do you make sure that, for example, it doesn't threaten the single market, where countries have an obligation to follow the common framework? But for example, in defense and security, there's a lot of possibility for this because there's not much in the treaties about cooperation on defense and security. So I think what we have seen as a risky but feasible way forward is to do quasi-EU. So the kind of coalitions of the willing, which to the outside world look remarkably like the EU, which have a lot of the features, which involve the institutions, which follow certain principles, which are open to others to come in. But when you look in the fine print, it actually is clear that it's not an EU initiative. And I think this is crucial now also because, for example, we've talked about the multi-annual financial framework. There are countries in Europe who find it incredibly difficult to argue in their domestic politics that they put more money into the European pot if some of that money then goes to Hungary or goes to other countries which are actually working against the interests of the Union in some areas. So it's also a way of excluding certain countries, which you don't want to have in certain policy areas.
Although,
Okay, I mean, the
of
MFF
course,
is obviously... Go on, Christine, sorry.
no, I just wanted to come in a little bit on the very last point, and perhaps that's a bit too technical, but there's one thing the European Commission has done, right, which is the common provisions regulation, where certain parts of the budget, mainly regional and cohesion funds, are linked to articles of the Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Mm-hmm.
The Commission has used this particular CPR to withhold funds from Hungary, and the beauty of this provision is that the Commission can refer to the Charter of Fundamental Rights rather than Article 2, which we touched upon before, and that the Commission doesn't need the Council to agree. And the Commission has frozen quite a bit of money for both Hungary and Poland a little while back. And that is, I think, something which personally I think is a really good tool, which the Commission should probably use a little more if it comes. And I think I'd never thought about it in relation to the budget negotiations, right? But to possibly also convince countries to give money under the proviso that the Commission can withhold money that is in this regulation. Since it's a regulation, it's not unanimity. It's passed by qualified majority in the Council and the Parliament. So I think this is something that the Commission could / perhaps even should do more of.
So the prior problem, presumably, is that you have to find a way of getting unanimous agreement for a 7-year budget.
Yes, no, absolutely. But Fabian was saying there are some countries that say, I don't want to give more money to Hungary, right?
Yeah.
A little bit. And if countries were, presume they are aware of that particular provision, perhaps that could convince them to give a little more money to Brussels. Of, let's say, it's not huge amounts of money that the European Commission has. I mean, obviously, it is a lot of money, but it's also 27 member states and lots of policies and crises and challenges to deal with.
What happens, just out of interest, if there isn't unanimous agreement on the MFF?
Huh.
It's untested territory. We have a provision in the treaties which says that if you don't have an agreement, the previous MFF is just sort of prorated and then continues. But that has never been tested, and there are big questions around that. Because, for example, a lot of the implementing legislation is specific to the time period of the budget. So if you no longer have the implementing legislation, how can you spend the money? So there are a lot of questions around how that would work in practice. But that also is an advantage in this area, because it means that also those countries which are trying to hold out have something to lose. They are not going to simply get the money without making these commitments. I think it's actually much more difficult in an area like enlargement, where arguably it is virtually costless for a country to block with their veto, as we have seen. And that then also creates, and I think this is also something for the MFF, it creates a political momentum that it's quite easy for some of the other countries which are reluctant to hide behind the country which is threatening the veto. There are many countries which are skeptical about aspects of the MFF. There are many countries which are skeptical about aspects of enlargement. But they can easily point at Hungary and say, it's not our fault, it's the Hungarians who always block us.
Mm-hmm. So a bit of a classic bargaining tactic, right, in the European Union, also in standard legislation.
Do either of you see a realistic prospect of Ukraine being a member state in the next decade?
Yes and no.
Oh, that's dreadful.
It's a dreadful answer.
We have a nice German word, which is Jein, which is ja, nein, and one.
You're going to have to flesh that out now.
Yeah. Sorry, Fabian, I come
No,
in
no,
after
it's
you.
I think what we are not doing at the moment, which we need to do, is I think we have to force the question. Uh, I think there are very strong areas of resistance, some of them more hidden than others. But I think we need to test out what would actually happen if we really push this. Not necessarily immediately with Ukraine. I think it's also important that we don't forget the Western Balkans. And it might well be that a Western Balkan country, a couple of Western Balkan countries, could be the kind of trailblazers where we try this out. But that we really push it on the agenda and we force member states to come clean on whether they are in the end supporting it or not. Only then will we know whether we can get it through. Countries like Hungary, under Orban at least, we have seen in the past that as long as you're willing to make some side payments, a kleptocracy is always moved by money, so it's not necessarily a hard veto when it comes to it. So I think we really need to get to the point where the countries have to put their cards on the table. If it is a no at that point in time, or which there's a realistic chance, and that's why we're saying Yein, I simply don't know. Then we have to find alternatives. And that means creating also structures, again, in parallel to the treaties, because we cannot have enlargement within the treaties if there's a veto, but in parallel to the treaties, where we start to treat Ukraine as if it is a member state in all areas of the EU, and in a sense create also a real cost for those who are blocking the accession of Ukraine and others. So just to give one example, you take a big chunk of the budget outside the treaties, and then you can finance all of the programs for Ukraine. And those countries inside who have been blocking just simply don't get the same amount of money as they did before. So there's a real price they would have to pay. But crucially, where this really depends on is not Hungary, is not some of the smaller member states. The big question is France and Germany.
Yeah.
Are they really willing to support this and push this through?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm maybe a bit more skeptical. I also think Poland may be a challenge in terms of agriculture. I think we've seen a bit of that. But I do think something needs to happen, because otherwise, I mean, it's a much easier thing to say than to do. But otherwise, we have a situation as we currently have in Georgia, right, where there's big pro-EU front, but a government that isn't pro-EU and rather rolls back provisions. I do think if there were sort of a side role maybe, but integrated in areas where Ukraine wants to be integrated. I also think for Ukraine, I do wonder whether it's really about enlargement or whether it's about the political signal sent through the enlargement process. Because enlargement, I think, if we look at foreign policy and if we think about enlargement as a foreign policy tool, then enlargement has been the most effective, successful policy tool by the EU. And I wonder whether Ukraine would actually be, quote unquote, happy or satisfied with a side role, a visible side role, quite linked to the European Union with, I don't know, good financial support. But then, of course, if you want to move money out of the current budget, it also has to be unanimous.
I suppose the other issue about Hungary, beyond kleptocracy and democratic backsliding, is the degree of influence that Russia has over Orban and over that government, which is clearly a massive problem. But it's not necessarily a problem that the European Union can do much about, is it?
Well, I would say, firstly, let's not write off Hungary just yet. In less than 6 months, we have an election.
Yep.
So let's see whether the situation is still the same after that. There is at least a reasonable chance now that when we are talking about this in 6 months' time, that we will not talk about Hungary as the continuous problem there. But it is true, there is a lot of foreign influence, but Hungary is also small. So in the end, can Hungary really have such an outsized impact? I think honestly, it's because we're letting it having that outsized impact. It's not because it really is able to. I think there should be more measures taken. Also, for example, in economic security areas, where we simply make Hungary pay a price for making these kind of choices. But that price might come anyway, given where the economic winds are blowing. But just just going back briefly on Ukraine and enlargement, I think what we shouldn't forget is it looks like Ukraine is not going to be in NATO. That I don't think is on the cards. Certainly Trump is against it, but also many other NATO member states would be blocking it, which raises the question of how do we anchor Ukraine into the Western alliance, because Ukraine is going to be a very big chunk of our eastern flank defense. And arguably probably the most capable and most important part of that eastern flank defense. So I think that's the kind of lens we should be looking at this with, not from a structural, internal, talking about how much money we will need to do this. I think these are also areas where Ukraine would be willing to compromise. But the most important thing is binding Ukraine into our structures.
Yeah, and of course, the other important thing is the outcome of the war. In these last 10 minutes, it'd be good to turn to sort of the EU's external policies. You mentioned, Fabian, I say trade deal. I think that's putting it kindly. But what happened at Turnberry between von der Leyen and Trump? And it seems to me that ultimately Europe could have fought back economically perfectly easily. The problem is strategic dependence. The problem is a fear that this would spark reprisals from the Americans in terms of reduced support for Ukraine. Now, there have been a plethora of EU initiatives with various acronyms, launched over the last 4 or 5 years to help enhance what I think you still call strategic autonomy, do you? What do you make of those? I mean, how well is the European Union doing at developing its military capabilities, at developing a greater degree of autonomy in that sphere?
I think we have certainly seen a lot of action in that area. We sometimes are better at producing the roadmaps and the strategy papers than the actual military material we need.
And the compasses.
The compasses and the omnibuses, and but I think that's a little unfair, because I do think there has been a shift also in mindset when it comes to that. But the reality is also that this takes time. And when it comes to certain technologies, certain weapon systems, then the Americans are much further ahead. And at this moment in time, that will mean that there is going to be a continued dependence. That dependence is not only at the practical level, that dependence is also at the strategic level. Clearly, European defense still relies on the American nuclear umbrella. It still relies on the involvement. Many of our command and control structures are very much integrated with the US. So it isn't feasible at this stage to go from a close alliance, possibly the closest alliance we've ever seen at that international level, to something which is completely separate. And that does open the door. And I know why our politicians are not expressing it in these terms. But I express it in these terms to extortion. It's a very simple process. If the American president wants his side payments, then it would be very brave for the Europeans to completely go against him, not least also because his character is such that he would react very badly to what he sees as opposition to a righteous cause. But I think there is more which could be done. And that is not necessarily on the performative politics side. I think there are limits to how you can deal with Trump. But for example, I think one area where we've missed a trick is bringing together all those countries which are negatively affected by Trump and starting to work together, maybe behind the scenes, maybe not in public, but starting to work out strategies of how we deal with these situations. Looking at, for example, different supply chains, making sure that we do research together in some of these future technologies. So there is a lot more I think we can do than we are doing at the moment, which also involves non-EU actors. It involves non-European actors. I mean, Canada, for example, is one of those countries which needs to be in there. But I think this is really critical because the one thing, and it astonishes me that still doesn't seem to be realized by everybody, whatever we have agreed with Trump is not worth the paper it is written on. He does not believe in agreements. He does not believe in law. He believes in making a deal. And if in a week's time he thinks there's a need to reopen this, he will reopen it. If he thinks there's a need to link it to security, he will link it to security. Within less than a week after the Turnberry deal, he was starting to talk again about digital legislation and what is happening in Europe there. So this is an ongoing issue which we are going to have to deal with for a long time. And I would even say that even when we have a change in politics in America with the midterms or with the next presidential election, some of the features of what we see now are going to be persistent.
I would just like to agree on this last point very much. So I think the US is not, moving away from Europe and the European continent towards the Pacific. And I think even if the next government is democratic, or even the Democrats or a different Republican president, I don't think we will get the United States back to where they were a few years ago. But I also think that there is movement right outside of Europe. So the EU is negotiating a trade agreement with India. There's one with Indonesia. So I do think the EU is shifting a little bit more into to the wider globe. And I also think there is a lot more money now actually spent on defense, on weapons. There is very little, I think, that the European Union as such, with the defense competences it has, can do. But I think this is an area where the member states can really work well together. What the European Union should be doing is really thinking about a defense single market. But in general, I think it's a world which is absolutely not a world that goes in any way with the European attachment to multilateralism, free trade, right, regulation, a rules-based order, values. I think the EU needs to really reorient itself in a world that has gone against all these principles.
Without wanting to come over all flag-waving Brit here, isn't the problem with the idea of a defence single market that it essentially excludes partners that the European Union needs to be working with? I mean, just following the progress of the SAFE negotiations at the moment, as the conditions seem to become ever more restrictive on not third country participation, because some third countries are doing quite well, but British participation, it does seem to me that a kind of integrationist logic might be working against the security logic. Maybe that's just me being biased, I don't know. But I mean, what do you make of that argument? Go on then, Fabian.
Yeah, but I think the EU needs the UK in defense. I think that's just an absolute fact. I mean, I'm also not unbiased towards the UK.
Well, and I mean, I'm laughing a bit because clearly during the Brexit negotiations, I had a very strong belief that the European interest had to be defended, and I think we did that rather well. But I think we are talking about a different world we're in now. And that also means that we have to move on certain issues which would otherwise not have been thinkable. We already talked about capital markets integration. That is also part of the single market. A single market for capital is equally one of the red lines which were there. But I think the key here is always to think of it from both sides and to identify what are the barriers which stop us from moving forward. And yes, I think there's a lot more scope to essentially rethink some of these structures in terms of like-minded countries. But that also means then a real discussion about who would be leading those kind of structures, what are the rules which are associated with the structures, who pays for certain things, and what kind of alignment is there in rules and in policy. So this is not an easy ask from any country. So for me, this is actually one of the most difficult things we are going to have to do in European integration. But in a sense, this is because we are now back at an era in history where it is about these fundamental structures rather than tweaking a little bit of what we already have.
Okay, we have, I'm afraid, run out of time on that bombshell from Fabian, which is a good place, I think, to leave it. Can I just thank both of you so much for doing this? I'd love to do it again in 6 months if you're willing, because I don't think we pay enough attention to the European Union here, and there's so much going on. It will be good to revisit this theme if that's okay. But for the moment, thank you so much to Fabian and Christine. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. You'll notice I put quite a few of your questions today, an undoubted element of progress in my chairing abilities. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. But for the moment, thanks ever so much. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.